Okay, so this week, consciousness, bats and zombies. This is our second lecture on consciousness. And we'll move on to a couple of different topics for the end of the unit in the next few weeks. We'll look at panpsychism, the view that we've got it all wrong because mind is in everything. And then we'll move on to we're going to look at animal minds in the last week and the intentional stance of Dennett's and so on. But we're going to wrap up the topic of consciousness today. Okay, so I posted these cartoons trying to motivate humorously somehow the issue that we're going to be looking at. So we'll look at Thomas Nagel's paper, What is it like to be a bat, first, and then move on to the zombie argument due to Dave Chalmers mainly. And you'll see, hopefully, that it's a kind of a revision of an earlier argument that we looked at from, that you can extract at least from Descartes. Okay, so here's the plan for today. We'll look at bats, zombies, and then some objections to the zombie argument. Okay, so here's Thomas Nagel, and he's posing a question about what the problem of consciousness is supposed to be, how we're supposed to frame it. And so he thinks that we don't really have a clear conception of what an explanation of consciousness would even look like. So we don't even know what the problem of consciousness, strictly speaking, consists in, given that we don't even know what an answer would look like in his view. And why does this matter? Well, it's because it's only when we have a clear idea of some target phenomenon that we know what a reductive, in this case physicalist, theory would even have to explain. So unless we've got a clear idea of the thing that we're trying to get at or explain, then any theory that we try to bring along to explain that thing, we don't even really know what that theory is supposed to look like, because we don't know what it's supposed to be explaining. So the strategy here is to try, and this is what the main aim of his article, What It's Like to Be a Bat, is getting at. The strategy is to identify some target phenomenon for a science or a theory of consciousness, and then offer some clear way of conceptually grounding that problem. Now, the claim that Nagel is making is that a mental state is phenomenally conscious. Now, we've been using these terms, and so it should be fairly clear, but let's just be totally clear about it. A mental state is phenomenally conscious if and only if there's something it's like. This is his terminology. It's actually kind of a piece of technical terminology now in philosophy of mind. So only if and only if there's something it's like for the subjective experience to be in that state. So for example, there's something it's like for a bat to be a bat, or to do some of the things that bats do. Okay, so that's going to be the way he has of operationalizing phenomenal consciousness. Now, the example that he's taking of bat consciousness is just supposed to help us identify what it is that we're trying to explain. It's supposed to be a strategy or a method for doing that. And so once we get clear then about what it is that we're trying to explain, then we can get much clearer, or that would be a way of getting much clearer about how to give a good theory of it or a good explanation of it. Okay, so why consider bats? Why think about bats at all? Why care about bats? Well, the idea he has, Nagel, is that we're fairly certain that bats are conscious. And we might doubt that spiders or scorpions and other insects maybe are conscious, but we're fairly sure that bats are conscious in some meaningful state or sense. But presumably bats are so different from us that we've got no idea what it's like to be a bat. So we know that bats primarily move around in space by orienting themselves in relation to other external objects by means of echolocation. So they make sounds that then bounce off things, and they hear those sounds coming back, and they can orient themselves that way. But we've got no idea, Nagel claims, what it's like to echolocate. and so we've got no idea what it's like to be a bat. Everybody on board so far? Anybody here know what it's like to be a bat? Any former bats here? Bat in a previous life? No? Or if so, don't remember? Okay. So the claim here is that we don't know what it's like to be a bat, and the reason that's important is just that it seems to pick out a creature that would have some phenomenally conscious states, but we've got no idea what it would be like for that creature. Now you might think, well, surely we can just imagine what it's like to be a bat. Okay? Imagine flying around at night and echolocating, hanging upside down during the day, etc. So Nagel thinks that's not enough. So even insofar as he might be able to imagine it, and he thinks that's not really very far, it only tells him what it would be like for him to behave as a bat. So you can imagine somebody sticking wings on you, and then you can go flapping around. But that's you flapping around. And then you might try to imagine what it's like to echolocate, and so on. But again, that's not presumably what it's like to be a bat. That is just what it would be like maybe for you to fly around and behave like a bat. And that's not the question that we're asking. And so what we want is to have a clear concept in some way of the target phenomenon, which is phenomenal consciousness, what it's like. And that's not achieved, he thinks, by just imagining what it might be like. Okay, so this issue came up, I know, in some of my tutorials even last week, ahead of schedule. But somebody suggested, well, look, isn't this just a slightly more exotic version of the other minds problem? So the other minds problem, we'll look at this actually in our last class, when we get on to other minds and other kinds of minds, and we look at animal minds. But the other minds problem in general in philosophy of mind is just about how we know, how we can gain access to the mental states of any other, say, human. How do we know that, how do you know that there's anything going on upstairs, as it were, for me? In particular here, how you know that there's anything it's like to be me, okay? I might be a zombie in Chalmers' sense. So the point here is that Nagel is kind of making a type claim. So he's only concerned with types of experiences belonging to certain types of creatures, and not with differences between individuals. So he's just bracketing the other minds, or the problem of other minds in philosophy of mind, about how we know the mental states of other creatures, even like ourselves, other human beings. So he's just talking about different types of experiences belonging to different types of creatures. So there's going to be something it's like to be a bat in general, and all bats will share that. And he's just assuming, for present purposes, that there's something it's like to be a human, and that we all pretty much know. If I say to you, oh, did you see that sunset last night? Wasn't it great? And you say yes, and you can sort of describe the colors you saw and what it was like to be there, and to have those experiences. And we just grant that we're each of us having similar sorts of experiences, in the same way that bats then have similar sorts of experiences to each other. But the claim here is that we don't know what it's like to have that type of experience, the type of experience that a bat would have. Okay, so we've no clear concept, he thinks, of bat consciousness. Or, of course, by generalization, any other type of conscious experience for any other creature. Now, somebody might also suggest, well, hey, look, couldn't a similar problem occur for humans? And the answer is yes, it could. Okay, so there are phenomena, interesting phenomena, fascinating phenomena, like synesthesia, where a color can be associated with a number, for example. And somehow people say, they report, and then you do testing on this, so it seems like it holds up, that people report colors being inherently associated with a number. And that seems like it's a type of experience, even though it's being had by one of our own type, as it were, another human being, that we would also have no access to. Perhaps even more interestingly, this character here, gosh, I forget his name off the top of my head, but you can look him up, and I've given the link to it here, which you can get when I post the slides. This is a guy in New York who has a very strong form of color blindness. And so he basically sees, I guess, in black and white, shades of gray. Okay? People say black and white, but of course it's never actually black and then white, right? It's actually just gray. People see in shades of gray. What he did was, this is a thing that's actually implanted into his brain back here. Okay? And he can reach up and bend it and move it around and point it towards things. And when he does that, it takes the surface reflectance properties of the objects around him that we then normally experience as color and translates them into a vibration that goes through a bone in his skull that basically makes him hear a sound. So he walks through Times Square with this thing, and he's seeing gray, 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 whereas we're seeing all the colors of all the neon signs, etc. And he points this thing around, and he's like hearing all of those colors.
Is this a real person? This is like a fictional character?
No, this is a real guy. You can look him up. It's an Atlantic article. Wow. It's a fascinating thing. I taught a whole section on this when I did a unit a couple of years ago in the University of Arizona on sensory modalities, and you look at all of the different work in different sensory modalities and how you individuate modalities, and it's really complex stuff, actually. But these are really interesting cases, and for present purposes, all it's meant to show is that presumably we've no idea what it's like to be him, okay? But that doesn't take away from Nagel's claim. He's still making this type-type distinction, and by all means there might be certain individuals, certain tokens of our type, other human beings, and it'll be the case that we just don't know what it's like to be them. But in general, most of us do share, we assume at least, common sorts of experiences. So the problem can occur for humans, but only in outlier special cases like this. But I encourage you to click on this link and have a look at the short video in the Atlantic magazine, which is pretty fascinating on this guy. Can't think of his name right now. Anyway. Harbison, yeah, that's right. Neil Harbison. Well done, good. Okay, thanks. Okay, so what we're thinking about here then, what Nagel wants us to start thinking about is subjectivity and objectivity. So consciousness and particular types of points of view. Now, you might think that normally when we make epistemic progress of a certain kind, gaining knowledge, clearer, more sort of concrete knowledge about any subject matter, what we're doing is we're gaining greater objectivity on it. Okay? The objectivity maybe of science, we might have some idea of this. But the problem here is that objectivity involves moving away from one's own subjective, personal point of view on the thing to an objective point of view that we can all share as common knowledge. So it just seems to require moving away from your own subjective point of view. But in the case of conscious experience, if we're looking for some objective way, say scientific way maybe, of having a theory or a science of consciousness, that will just mean moving away from the very thing. It's an odd phenomenon to be investigating. It would mean moving away from the very thing that we're trying to investigate, which is the subjectivity of consciousness. So as you try to get a science of consciousness, you try to get more objective about it, you move away from the very thing that you're trying to explain, which is the subjectivity of consciousness. And so Nagel's question, in a sense, here is whether an objective science of consciousness is even possible, because of this idea of just having to move away from the subjectivity in order to get objective. Now, he doesn't answer it definitively. He thinks, well, maybe, but if the prospects for an objective science of consciousness end up being limited in some way, then we might just be unable to even understand physicalism, even if it's true, he thinks. Okay, so he's got a famous book called The View from Nowhere. I've just put a picture of it down here. But you might ask, well, what does it even mean to have that kind of view? What's a view from nowhere? Now, you know, I could put something kind of corny up here, like an armchair sitting out in the middle of the Sahara Desert or something. Somebody sitting in it, right? A view from nowhere, middle of nowhere, and I'm having a view, okay? That's not what he means, obviously. The idea is that if you're getting objective, it's not supposed to be tied to any particular point of view, but it's supposed to nevertheless be a view. But what kind of view is it if there's no viewpoint? Okay, it's a view, as it were, from nowhere. It seems like having a view is just inherently tied to having a first-person perspective. And so you might wonder whether Nagel's metaphor, what he thinks we ought to be, in a way, striving for that will get us into trouble, this objectivity or this view from nowhere, that metaphor of the view from nowhere doesn't even make sense. It might be that you know, we can't even grasp this idea of somehow having an objective science of consciousness that's independent of any particular point of view. Okay, so that's Nagel's article. Now, there's a lot going on in that article. It's a famous article. I was kind of envious in a sense of everybody reading it this week, because I remember reading it for the first time, and it was kind of mind-blowing to me. But for present purposes, what I want to draw attention to is just one aspect of the article, and that is this idea of trying to operationalize what consciousness is, so that we would even be able to have a theory of how to explain that. And it has this problem of, well, if you're going to do it scientifically, it seems to require becoming objective, but that seems to move away from the main phenomenon. So that's why, in the quote that I gave last week, I think, Nagel says that, you know, without consciousness or qualia, the problem of, you know, philosophy of mind seems like it's full of just easy problems. But with philosophy, or with consciousness or qualia, it seems intractable, he thinks.